They moved me to the basement the same week my husband was buried, and the next morning, I heard a stranger upstairs say, "This room is beautiful." I didn't say anything. I just sat there on that narrow cot next to the rattling water heater, listening to footsteps above my head in what used to be my bedroom, my room with the bay window and the oak dresser I'd polished every Sunday for 30 years. And when I finally walked upstairs that afternoon, my sheets were gone, my photos were gone, replaced with clean white linens and a welcome basket like I had never existed. And my daughter-in-law just smiled and said it was temporary, but that night I saw a couple dragging suitcases into my house like it was a hotel, and I realized they weren't just pushing me aside. They were making money off erasing me. So I waited, I watched, and the next morning, I found my bedroom listed online with photos I recognized better than my own reflection, and that's when I understood. They thought I was too old to notice, too broken to fight back. But they forgot one thing. My name was still on that house, and what I did next, they never saw coming. I woke up the next morning before sunrise, not because I had slept well, but because the basement never truly let you forget where you were. The air felt heavier down there, cooler by a few degrees, like the rest of the house had been reserved for comfort, while this space was meant for storage, not for living. And I sat up slowly on that narrow bed, listening again. There it was, the faint movement above me, a door opening, soft footsteps crossing the floor, and then silence, followed by the distant hum of running water, someone using the bathroom that used to be connected to my bedroom. I stayed still for a moment, letting the sound settle, not reacting, just observing, the way I had learned to do over the years, because reacting too soon often meant missing what really mattered. I folded the blanket carefully, smoothing out the corners like I always did, a habit I had carried through decades. Small rituals that made a place feel like mine even when it was not. And then I walked up the stairs again, slower this time, quieter, not to confront anyone, just to see. The kitchen was already in use. My daughter-in-law stood by the counter pouring coffee into a mug that was not one of mine. Something newer, something she must have bought recently. She glanced at me briefly, her smile polite but distant, like I was a guest passing through, not someone who had once decided where every piece of furniture belonged. My son sat at the table scrolling through his phone, not looking up, not saying good morning, just existing in the same space without acknowledging the shift that had taken place. I poured myself a cup of coffee without asking, the familiar motion grounding me, and I noticed small changes, details that would mean nothing to anyone else, but everything to me. The drawer where I kept the spoons had been reorganized. The cabinet above the sink now held different plates. Even the scent of the house had changed slightly, like something new had been layered over something old, and I understood then that what I was seeing was not temporary, it was deliberate. Later that afternoon I sat by the small basement window, the one that barely reached ground level, watching the outline of passing shoes on the sidewalk outside, people walking by who had no idea what was happening inside this house. And that was when I heard it again, voices upstairs, not just one this time but two, a conversation between strangers, light, casual, comfortable, as if they had every right to be there. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough phrases about the neighborhood, about how convenient the location was, about how quiet the place felt, and I almost smiled at that, because quiet was not the word I would have chosen, not anymore. I stood up and walked to the foot of the stairs, not climbing them, just standing there, listening more carefully now, and then I heard something that settled everything into place. It was such a good deal, one of them said. For a room like this, I did not expect it to be this nice. And there it was, clear, undeniable, not a misunderstanding, not a temporary arrangement, but a transaction, a decision made without me, about something that had once been entirely mine. I stepped back slowly, returning to the basement without making a sound, and sat down again on the edge of that narrow bed, my hands resting calmly in my lap, because by then, I was no longer confused, I was no longer guessing. I knew exactly what they were doing, and more importantly, I knew they believed I would never question it, never challenge it, never even fully understand it. And that belief, more than anything else, was the first real mistake they made. I did not confront them that day or the day after. Instead, I began to pay attention in a way I had not needed to before, not as a mother, not as someone who trusted, but as someone who had quietly stepped outside of the story they believed I was still living in. That evening we sat at the same table we had used for years, the same table where I had once served birthday dinners and holiday meals. But now it felt different, not because the furniture had changed, but because the meaning had. My daughter-in-law spoke easily about schedules and bookings as if she was discussing something ordinary, something practical. She did not look at me when she mentioned how busy things had been, how people were always looking for a place to stay, and my son nodded along, his voice low, agreeing with her without adding anything of his own, and I noticed that neither of them asked me how I was sleeping downstairs. Neither of them mentioned the room that had once been mine. It was as if the shift had already been accepted as permanent in their minds, and I sat there, listening, not interrupting, not correcting, just observing the spaces between their words, because that was where the truth usually lived. After dinner, I cleared my own plate without waiting. Another small change, something I had not done before, and as I walked past the hallway I saw the bedroom door slightly open, a soft light spilling out into the corridor. I did not stop, but I slowed just enough to see inside. The suitcase from earlier was still there, open now, clothes neatly arranged on the bed, my bed, and a pair of unfamiliar shoes placed carefully by the door, as if they belonged there, as if I never had. I continued walking without a sound, back down the stairs, step by step, the same 13 steps that had started to feel longer each time. And when I reached the basement, I sat down again, hands resting in my lap, breathing evenly, because by then I understood that what they were doing was not careless. It was structured, planned, repeated. This was not the first time someone had stayed in that room, and it would not be the last. The next morning, I moved quietly through the house before anyone else was awake, not searching openly, not opening drawers or asking questions, just noticing, the kind of noticing that did not leave a trace. I saw a notebook on the kitchen counter, partially tucked under a stack of mail, numbers written in neat columns, dates, amounts, short notes beside them, nothing labeled clearly, but enough to suggest a pattern. I did not touch it. I did not need to, because the pattern was already forming in my mind. Later that day, I stood outside the house for a moment, something I had not done in years, looking at it from the street instead of from inside, and I saw something I had not allowed myself to see before. It looked the same windows, the same porch, the same front door my husband had painted every few summers. But now it felt like a place being used, not lived in. And that was the difference. I went back inside without hesitation, not rushing, not hesitating, just stepping through the door like I always had. Because no matter what had changed inside, one thing had not changed at all, and they had not yet realized it. But I was beginning to understand it more clearly with each passing hour. This house was not just a space they could rearrange. It was something with a history, with decisions behind it, decisions that had been made long before they started renting out rooms and moving people around. And for the first time since I had been sent downstairs, I allowed myself to think not about what they had done, but about what they had overlooked, because sometimes the most important detail is not what is taken from you, but what remains untouched. The pattern became clearer the longer I remained quiet, not because they revealed anything directly, but because they assumed I was no longer paying attention, and that assumption made them careless in small ways that mattered. That evening I stayed upstairs a little longer after dinner, not enough to draw attention, just enough to exist in the space as I once had, and I noticed how naturally my daughter-in-law moved through the house, opening drawers I had organized years ago, adjusting things without hesitation, as if ownership had quietly transferred without a word being spoken, and my son followed her rhythm, not leading, not questioning, simply adapting to the version of reality she had created. And when she mentioned another booking for the weekend, she did not lower her voice, she did not hesitate. She simply spoke as though it was an ordinary part of their life, and I realized then that in their minds, it was. Later that night, I walked past the hallway again, slower this time, and the door to the bedroom was closed, a small detail, but one that carried meaning, because that door had always been open when it was mine, and now it was something else, something managed, something rotated between strangers who would come and go without ever knowing what had existed before them. I placed my hand lightly on the door for a moment, not pushing it open, just feeling the surface, the same wood, the same handle, unchanged, and yet everything behind it had been replaced, and I withdrew my hand without a sound, returning downstairs with the same steady pace, because by then I understood that what I needed was Not confrontation. It was clarity. The next morning I stepped outside again, this time walking a few feet farther down the driveway, enough to see the house from a slight angle, enough to notice details I had overlooked when I stood too close. And that was when I saw it. A small lockbox attached near the side of the porch, subtle, easy to miss unless you knew what you were looking for, and I paused for a moment, not touching it, just observing, because I had seen something like that before. Years ago when my husband and I had traveled and rented a place for a weekend, a way to let people enter without needing to meet anyone, a system built on convenience and distance, and I almost smiled at how simple it was, how quietly it had been added to the house without a single conversation, as if it had always been there. I turned and walked back inside, closing the door gently behind me, and as I passed through the living room I noticed another detail. A printed sheet placed neatly on the coffee table, instructions, house rules, a list of guidelines for guests, written in a tone that was polite but firm, and I read it without picking it up, scanning the words quickly, noting the language, the structure, the assumption that whoever read it would follow without question, and I realized that this was no longer just about a room. It was an operation, something organized, repeated, managed over time, and yet, in all of it, there was one thing missing, something so basic that it almost felt intentional. There was no mention of ownership, no acknowledgement of who the house truly belonged to, and that absence was not an accident. It was an omission they believed would never matter. I went back downstairs once more, sitting on the edge of the bed, hands folded calmly, and for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to think not about what they had done, but about what I had, because there were documents, decisions, signatures that existed beyond this moment, things that had been put in place long before anyone thought to rent out a room or move someone to a basement, and those things had not disappeared. They had not been replaced or rewritten. They were still there, unchanged, waiting, and as I sat in the quiet hum of that basement, listening to the distant sounds above me, I understood something with a certainty that no longer needed proof. They believed this house had become theirs simply because they were living in it. But they had forgotten that living in a place and owning it are not the same thing, and that difference, quiet as it was about to matter more than anything else. The next morning I did something I had not done in years. I opened the drawer in the small desk I had brought down to the basement, the one piece of furniture I insisted on keeping when they told me to move downstairs, and inside it were the things I had not needed to look at for a very long time. Envelopes, folders, documents that had once felt important and then slowly became part of the background of a life that seemed stable, predictable, secure. I pulled out a thin folder with my name on it, Helen Carter, written in my own careful handwriting from years ago, and I sat there for a moment before opening it, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because I already knew what was inside. I just had not needed to confirm it until now. The paper felt slightly worn at the edges as I unfolded it, the kind of wear that comes from time, not from use. And there it was, clear, unchanged, my name listed exactly where it had always been, not altered, not transferred, not shared, just mine, and I read through it slowly, not rushing, not searching for something new, just reminding myself of something old, something they had either forgotten or never fully understood. Upstairs I could hear movement again, another set of footsteps, another arrival, another departure, the rhythm of a house that had turned into something transactional. But down here, in the quiet, the truth was still intact. I placed the document back into the folder carefully, smoothing it flat before closing it, because this was not about reacting, it was about timing. Later that afternoon, I walked upstairs again, not hesitating, not announcing myself, just moving through the space with the same steady pace I had always had, and I noticed more details now that I was looking with intention. The lockbox outside had been opened recently. The kitchen counter had a new note written in the same handwriting as before, a check in time, a reminder about keys, small instructions that assumed a system was in place, and I let my eyes pass over everything without stopping, without drawing attention, because what I needed was not visible in those details. It was confirmed already. My son entered the room while I stood by the window, and for a brief moment our eyes met. Not long enough for a conversation, just long enough to recognize that something had shifted. He looked like he wanted to say something, but he did not, and I did not help him, because silence had become the language of this house. and I was beginning to understand it better than either of them. That evening I returned to the basement again, but it felt different now, not because the space had changed, but because I had the low ceiling, the hum of the water heater, the narrow bed. None of it carried the same weight it had before, because it was no longer a place I had been sent to. It was a place I had chosen to observe from. And as I sat there, hands resting calmly, I began to think not about what they had done, but about what I would do next, not in anger, not in haste, but with the same quiet certainty that had guided me through every major decision in my life. Because this was not just about reclaiming a room. It was about restoring something they had assumed could be taken without consequence. And the more I listened to the footsteps above me, the more I understood that they believed the story was already finished, that the arrangement was set, that I had accepted my place in it. But they were wrong. Not because I was about to confront them, not because I was going to raise my voice or demand explanations, but because I had something they had overlooked from the very beginning, something that did not require permission or approval, something that had been there long before they started renting out rooms and moving people around. And as I leaned back slightly, closing my eyes for just a moment, I allowed myself to acknowledge it fully, because the house they were managing, the space they were dividing and selling piece by piece, had never stopped belonging to me, not for a single second, and now that I had confirmed it, everything else would follow in its own time. The following morning I did not rush. I did not change my routine, because changing too quickly would have drawn attention, and attention was the one thing I no longer needed. Instead, I moved through the house with the same quiet rhythm they had grown used to, pouring my coffee, standing by the window, letting the light fall across the counter in the same way it always had. But this time I was not simply passing through the moment. I was measuring it, observing what belonged and what did not. And when my daughter-in-law walked into the kitchen, she barely looked at me, just a brief glance before continuing with her morning as if I were part of the background. And that told me everything I needed to know about how comfortable she had become, how certain she was that nothing would change. My son followed a few minutes later, still avoiding conversation, still choosing silence over acknowledgement, and I allowed it, because silence had become useful. Later that day, I took a small step, not a dramatic one, just enough to begin shifting things without making it obvious. I walked past the hallway again, and this time I did not stop at the door. I opened it, slowly, calmly, as if I had every reason to do so, because I did. Inside the room, everything was arranged neatly. The bed made the air faintly scented with something artificial, a space designed to feel welcoming but not personal. And I stepped inside without hesitation, taking in the details with a quiet precision, the placement of the pillows, the folded towels, the small card on the nightstand that listed house guidelines. And I read it fully this time. Every word, every instruction, noting the tone, the assumptions, the structure of something that had clearly been repeated many times before. And then I walked to the closet and opened it, slowly, without urgency. Inside there were only a few empty hangers and a single shelf with spare linens. Nothing of mine remained, not a single trace, and yet I did not feel the loss in that moment, because I already knew where everything that mattered was, not in that room, not in the arrangement they had created, but in something far less visible. I closed the closet door gently and stepped back into the hallway, leaving everything exactly as I found it, because I was not there to disrupt. I was there to confirm. That evening I sat downstairs again, but this time I brought the folder with me, placing it on the small desk under the dim light, and I opened it once more, not to read it again, but to think through what came next. The steps were not complicated, but they required patience, the kind of patience that builds over years, not days, and I had that. I had learned it. Long before any of this began, upstairs I could hear another guest arriving, the familiar sound of a car door, footsteps on the porch, the soft click of the lockbox, and then the door opening, all of it happening without any need for permission, without any awareness of what stood behind it. And I listened carefully, not with frustration, but with clarity, because each sound confirmed the same thing. They had built a system that depended on the idea that nothing would interrupt it, and that was where they had miscalculated. I leaned back slightly in the chair, hands resting calmly, and allowed the realization to settle fully, because I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was preparing for what I would do, and it would not require raised voices or sudden actions. It would require timing, precision, and a quiet certainty that did not need to be announced. And as the voices upstairs faded into the background, replaced by the steady hum of the house settling into another routine, I understood that the next step was already within reach, not visible to them, not something they could anticipate, but something that had been waiting all along. And when the moment came, it would not be loud, it would not be chaotic, it would simply be undeniable. The next day, I left the house without telling anyone where I was going, not because I needed permission, but because for the first time in a long time, I understood that I did not owe them an explanation. The morning air was cool, just under 60 degrees, and I walked slowly down the sidewalk, not in a hurry, not trying to escape, just moving with purpose, because there was something I needed to confirm outside the walls of that house, something that required more than memory, more than quiet observation. I drove to a place I had not visited in years, a small office building with a faded sign and a parking lot that looked exactly the same as it always had. And when I stepped inside, the scent of paper and polished wood brought back a different kind of memory, one that had nothing to do with the life upstairs or the basement below, but everything to do with decisions made long ago, careful decisions, deliberate ones. The receptionist looked up at me with a polite smile, asking how she could help, and I gave my name, Helen Carter, clearly, calmly, the way I always had, and within a few minutes I was seated across from a man who recognized me, not immediately, but enough to understand why I was there once I spoke. I did not explain everything. I did not need to. I simply asked for copies, confirmation, clarity, and he nodded as if it was the most normal request in the world, because to him, it was documents were retrieved, folders opened, and there it was again, not just one paper, but several, consistent, aligned, each one reinforcing the same simple truth. Nothing had changed, not legally, not structurally, not in any way that mattered. And I thanked him, not with emotion, not with relief, but with the same steady tone I had used all along, because this was not a discovery, it was a confirmation. When I walked back outside, the air felt different, not warmer, not brighter, just clearer, as if something that had been quietly unsettled had now found its place again. I returned home without hesitation, pulling into the driveway the same way I always had, the house standing there unchanged on the outside, holding everything inside it without revealing any of it. And as I stepped through the front door, I heard voices again, another guest, another conversation, another moment unfolding without awareness of what had just been confirmed. I did not interrupt. I did not announce my return. I simply moved through the space, placing my keys on the counter, noticing how ordinary everything looked, how easy it would be to believe that nothing significant had shifted. But I knew better now, not because something new had appeared, but because something old had been secured. That evening I sat in the basement again, but it no longer felt like a place of waiting. It felt like a place of preparation. The folder rested on the desk beside me, untouched, because I no longer needed to open it. I already knew what it contained. And upstairs, the sounds continued, footsteps, laughter, doors opening and closing, the rhythm of a house operating under a belief that had not yet been challenged, and I listened to it all with a calm that no longer came from patience alone, but from certainty, because they still believed the arrangement would continue exactly as it had been, that I would remain quiet, that nothing would interrupt their system, and I allowed them to believe that, for now, because timing mattered, and I was no longer reacting to their choices, I was moving toward my own, and when that moment arrived, it would not require explanation, it would not depend on emotion, it would simply reveal what had always been true, in a way they could no longer ignore. The next morning felt no different on the surface, the same light through the kitchen window, the same quiet hum of appliances, the same distant footsteps above me. But beneath it, something had shifted in a way that could not be seen, only felt, and I moved through the house with that awareness, not changing anything, not drawing attention, just existing in a space that I now understood more clearly than anyone else inside it. My daughter-in-law was already at the table with her phone, scrolling through something with a focused expression, and I caught a brief glimpse of a listing page before she tilted the screen away, not quickly, not nervously, just instinctively, as if some part of her knew that certain things were not meant to be shared. My son stood by the counter pouring coffee, his movements automatic, practiced, And for a moment he looked at me again, longer this time, as if trying to measure something he could not quite define, but he said nothing, and I did not help him find the words, because silence had become the space where everything important was unfolding. Later that afternoon, I noticed a new set of luggage by the door, smaller this time. A single suitcase, neatly placed beside a pair of unfamiliar shoes, and I watched as the front door opened and a woman stepped inside. Glancing around with that same curious appreciation I had heard in voices before, her eyes moved across the walls, the furniture, the light, and I saw the moment she accepted it as temporary, as something she could occupy without question, and my daughter-in-law greeted her with a smile that felt rehearsed, warm, but measured, explaining where things were, how everything worked, and I stood there just long enough to observe the exchange before turning away, not because I wanted to avoid it, but because I had already seen enough. The pattern was complete, the system was functioning exactly as they intended, and that was what made it so fragile. That evening I walked upstairs again, not quietly this time, not cautiously, just normally, as if nothing had changed, because in many ways, for me, it had not. And I paused in the hallway outside the bedroom, listening for a moment before gently turning the handle and opening the door. The guest inside looked up, surprised but not alarmed, and I met her eyes with a calm expression, not apologizing, not explaining, just acknowledging her presence as I stepped into the room for a brief moment, taking in the space once more, and then I said something simple, something that carried no emotion but held more weight than anything I had said before. I told her, in a steady voice, that I hoped she was comfortable, that if she needed anything, she could ask, and she nodded politely, unaware of what stood behind those words, unaware of the history beneath her feet, and I left the room just as calmly as I had entered it, closing the door behind me without a sound, because this was not about her. It was never about the guests. It was about the structure that allowed them to be there. And as I walked back downstairs, step by step, I understood that everything was now in place, not for confrontation, not for conflict, but for something far simpler and far more final, because they had built their system on the assumption that I would remain invisible within it, that I would accept the role they had assigned to me. And for a while, I had allowed that, not because I agreed, but because I needed to see it fully, to understand it completely, and now that I did, there was nothing left to question, nothing left to confirm, only the moment itself, waiting, and when it came, it would not need to be explained, it would not require raised voices or dramatic gestures, it would simply reveal what had always been true, in a way that could not be ignored or undone.